give you one example out of that program, Tax Administration Reform Program, we call it TARP. One of that systems that are under development still is what we call the concept of a data warehouse. Now, this concept is basically trying to get information from third parties, all potential economic sources from wherever information is being generated. You collect that information. A substantial effort is already there in terms of the automation and filing of the electronic returns and all that. So when you are having that type of electronic information already coming to you, then the system is supposed to take over from there as such, as opposed to any human intervention per se. And then having verified its correctness, arithmetic and otherwise, etc., you then go and access the data in the data warehouse. And that is where you try and compare or match the two informations. And when you do that, you will either find that it agrees, this is good, but most of the time it will not agree, and that should throw up those queries or differences for the for pursuing it with the potential taxpayers who may not even, one who have filed the return but they have underreported, and the other lot will be, or most of it would be, who have not filed at all. But here you now have a database which gives you enough actual substantive information which should enable you to actually get to him. And that, by the way, is not going to be something totally out of the world. It is something which is now a kind of in the recognized system in most of the countries of the world. And in fact, some of the countries have gone to the extent of actually getting live data of the banks made available to the tax authorities online, which means that whatever transactions are taking place in your bank account, that is something which is being online reported to the tax authorities. So in this way, you can't say that this is my sale, because your actual sale is reflected in your bank accounts. So, and the expenditures and whatever else, and the assets and whatever. So this way, I think perhaps in our cash-based economy and our non-documented society, one of the systems which is so important is something we need to really focus on as part of the reform program, by the way, and move it on. And will have to have the will of the government of the day, whoever that may be, to really put it through. And in my judgment, I feel that with all the issues and problems that we face today, I believe that we have no other option other than to make sure that we have everything going across the board for contributions to the economy by all who can afford it. Of course, it is beyond your minimum threshold, and that is if it is proven that you do have those type of resources, I think it is only fair to contribute your share accordingly as per the law. And similarly, there were other initiatives which partially have been completed also. The other part is also in process, and predominantly ultimate idea being that you need to strengthen the institute with like tools of the trade, I would say, to be able to carry out your business efficiently and transparently. And proper re-engineering, business process re-engineering exercises on every issue or every activity, I would say, has been done. Then total automation of those processes, and then trying to take away that discretion which really, creates this problem of inefficiency on one side and transparency on the other side. Now, in addition to all these things which are there on the inland revenue side, because there are two main parts now or divisions in the organization. One is the inland revenue now, which is all the internal taxes, income tax, sales tax and excise duty. and the other is the customs duty. And in the case of customs, again a similar exercise was undertaken. Total business process re-engineering was done, and the whole process of uh, clearing of your goods, imports or exports was totally automated, and it was a web-based, or is continues to be on a pilot basis system, which is web-based, totally electronic, and without any human interface you can have your goods cleared, provided they are not going to be picked up by the system on a test check basis, because there is a risk profiling system provided in it, and that then would either clear your consignment or will ask for some further information, or may in certain percentage of cases ask for some physical inspection. Now that again has been tried, has been tested as a system by the name of PAX, as you must be knowing, but it still remains there for further decision making. Had to be rolled out throughout the country after some upgradations, but unfortunately has not yet been done. So again, there has to be a focus, and we need to really try and push the government to understand the importance of this, and thereby create an environment in the institution which does not have to, create that environment of harassment uh, and total, lack of interest or efficiency, but you have to now make sure that it is a totally transparent environment, and gives you total efficiency as well. Now, on the other side, so this is one part of the two things I mentioned to you. The other part is basically the issue of policy, tax policy. This is the tax administration side, the other is the tax policy side. Now, in the tax policy, as we all know, unfortunately and historically, uh, if we look at the contributions to the economy by different sectors, and we then look at the contribution of the taxes by different sectors, there is a total mismatch. Now, if you see, for instance, our manufacturing sector, it contributes about 18% to the economy. And out of the total taxes that you collect, almost two-thirds are being collected through the manufacturing sector. Now, the other sectors, which is agriculture and services, which contribute more than 80% of the total economy, are contributing less than a third of the total taxes. And in that third is predominantly coming from the services sector. And if you look at agriculture, there is less than 1% actually. So, as a policy, what needs to be done is that it has to be equitable, it has to be across the board. And if beyond a certain minimum threshold, whatever you have decided, like 300,000 at the moment, if you exceed your income from any source, irrespective, that should be taxed like you are taxing the others. So, this will have to also be done, in my judgment, whether we like it or not. And we are seeing now more and more debate and discussion taking place about agriculture tax and things like that, etc. So, if we can try and focus on these two matters, I would say, one, make sure you have the capability now to be able to implement whatever you're supposed to implement through this institution, and you've got to give a total focus, not this kind of a, uh, sort of casual attitude of dealing with it. And secondly, as government, you will have to take some policy decisions, which you will have to ensure that they are across the board, and without, I don't like this person, so I must tax him, and I like this person and I will exempt him. You cannot do that. That liberty is not going to be there anymore. So I'll just leave it till that. Thank you very much, because there is a lot one can talk about.
And thank you very much, Abdullah Sahab. Next speaker is Mr. Shabir Zaidi, very well respected in Karachi, Islamabad circles as an authority on taxes. We know that he's a distinguished chartered accountant, has been on the Pakistan, chairing the Pakistan Accounting Foundation, member of the Developing Nations Committee, the International Federation of Accountants, and president of the South Asian Federation of Accountants. But more importantly for our purposes at the moment, he is member of the Revenue Advisory Council and the member of the Task Force for Reform of Taxes. Over to Zaidi Saab, maybe he can pick up some of the points which Abdullah Saab has raised. In particular, maybe he could comment a bit, seeing that we are in the OICCI, about the nature of our tax policies as they relate to foreign investors.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Since I have been involved in the three sides of taxation, so it will be more relevant for me to say something different, because I have been representing OICCI member as a tax advisor. I have been the president of the Institute Chartered on Pakistan, looking at that side. Fortunately, unfortunately, I have been the member of all the task forces in the 5 year on taxation reforms, including Shahid Hussain Committee, and I am presently the member of the Revenue Advisory Council and the Tax Reform Coordination Group, sitting with people. The way things are not good, I may be one of the responsible person behind that. But I have made a small presentation on some of the issues. I was just upon the taxation side. Is there someone who can cross it? Yes. I will just go next. Actually, next. Yes. So when we say about economy generally, I just say one thing: war on terror, flood, army, rupee, and dollar. These are our main discussions. No, we concentrate on these things. Next. But let me very briefly come to then I come to the taxation point. I think the Pakistan is at the moment is short of rupees. I would say not of dollars. Very strangely, Rishad Saab mujhse zyada better jante. And I think this is a very special time. We come to the West. We are really short of rupees. External support would not be a sustainable result. And I again say, story on war on terror and flood will not fly. वो story खत्म हो गई, अब नहीं चलेगी. There is no, I think in my view, there is no concrete recovery plan with any political party, technocrats and donor agency. We have to admit it, some defects, and we have to give a concrete plan now. And the situation is not very good. I could go ahead next. And next, just. And I obviously IMF is not a solution. It is a stopgap arrangement. They will not let us die, but they cannot teach how to live. And the world economy, we talk too much about the world economy, but generally at the moment it's a local issue. It's a local issue. It's still, as Saab said, agriculture sector is sustaining the economy. It is still the contributory sector of the economy. Media, politicians, academics are insensitive on real economic issues, not able to bring nation into single point agenda. And masses are disoriented, there is a huge trust gap, and they are intoxicated by personal corruption stories. आप सारा दिन एक personal corruption story की बात करते रहते हैं. So, they are not concentrating on the real issues. Next. I just go very quick. Next, please. The revenue collection I will stress on because I am a member of the advisory council. We started with 1667. We brought it down to 1607. We brought it down to 1588. And now, as a revenue advisory council, you must have read in the paper, we have said, government is not agreeing, we have said that if you achieve 1535, it will be a good target. It said if you achieve 1535, it will be a good target. 1588 is the projected target. It will be a good achievement, I would say. It will be a good achievement, yes, it will be a good achievement, I would say, because we have to collect something like 550 billion in another 3.5 months. And the way it has been collected, it can be very dangerous for some of you who are sitting around here. Because I was sitting in the Chief Commissioner's conference and the ways it was discussed. So 1535 is the figure which we can achieve. The government will go for 1588. This 50 billion will be recovered from you people. I can assure you it will be from you people. Government borrowings still very high. I have not talked about the other economic issues. This is not my subject. Next, please. Next. But now coming to next year, let's talk about the future. Why should we consider what happens has happened? I think if we go even to the maximum, what we can think about an advisory council in 2012-13, we cannot. I will not subscribe any budget collection of 18 plus. It will be a very optimistic budget if we cross 1800. Very optimistic. And with 18, I think government borrowing will be around 1,000 billion. Something like that. So I will just leave it and I will concentrate on these three sentences I have written. There is no space to be optimistic. And the year next is the election year. So no effective policy from the political parties is expected. You know, the year next is the election year. So I would say, I will be realistic. Subsidies, public sector enterprise, circular debt, government borrowings. These four issues, in my view, will remain unresolved in 2012-13. I think that if we can say we can solve it, we can start trying to do it. But sitting in April 19, coming from Islamabad directly, I am coming from Islamabad. I don't think the four issues: subsidies, PSC, circular debt, government borrowings. I have no vision or no seen how it can be resolved in another, maybe after 13-14, but in the immediate year we will not be able to do any reasonable contribution toward resolving these issues. So what we have to do now, we have only one space: concentrate on documentation and fair recovery of taxes. There is no third any alternate left. With any one, neither foreign support, nothing can improve our position unless we concentrate on documentation and fair recovery of taxes. This is the I think there is no message left, because in 2012-13 we have to do something next. And I will say that this government is stuck up in, this government in the Pakistan is stuck up in a very strange vicious circle. Next. There is a low revenue collection, which leads to high government borrowing, which leads to high discount rate, which leads to low investment, and then again low PSC, and again low collection of taxes. I think we are not getting out of this circle. And I don't see any way of getting out of this circle. And I will not concentrate on any other part, I will just concentrate on the revenue collection part of this next. If you go on this, which is this revenue side of this circle, there is undocumented economy not contributing towards tax to GDP ratio, which is minus 10%, and that economy is, I will explain what the Aarti Mafia is. I will explain it. Yes, I will explain it. The undocumented economy is contributing, in my view, something like plus 30 to 40% of the economy of the country, and they are not contributing anything to the tax to GDP ratio. And other issues which I highlighted on the other side of the picture is Afghan transit trade, which is affecting almost all of you very badly. There is an issue of underinvesting which is affecting all of you very heavily, which investment key. This issue is affecting your business, because I am your auditor at times and I am the tax advisor. I know how this underinvesting is killing the OICCI members and how they are affecting their businesses. Then Aarti Mafia, what I was saying, in Pakistan, the trading community, the middleman, is contributing substantially to the economy and not paying any single paisa of taxes. We are talking about agriculture income tax, yes, but a bulk of the taxation missing link is not in the hand of the agriculturist. It's a middleman in between the grower and the actual consumer. And this is the mafia, out of which maybe 150 maybe MNAs sitting in the assemblies. You know, we don't understand, we underestimate that kind of people, which is actually when Abdullah was talking about tax gap. It was economic side of it, but if you go down, deep down practically and identify which are the people and trade who are not contributing, I think artists and the middlemen are the people who are not contributing. Have you ever seen any butcher in Pakistan paying taxes? Are they not having taxes income? Have you seen any person going denting painting shop? Is he paying any taxes? Have you seen any middleman in the money? I mean, in the milk market, have they paid any taxes in any sort in this country? So when we are saying that there is a tax gap, we have to identify which are the places where the actual revenue generation is coming, where the value addition is being done, where the margin is there and taxes are not being recovered. So we have to be very clear. Whether that's what I'm saying, artists, mafia. Retailers are not contributing any tax in this country. Effectively, none. Real estate services are not contributing reasonably into tax in that. Real estate is not contributing anything in this contribution, and agriculture tax is levied but it is not being recovered. So, from the low revenue side, unless we plug these things, we have sat down in many tax reform committees and commissions. But the question is, we have to concentrate, I would say focus concentration on certain areas where the correction is low. Otherwise, again what will happen? The whole burden will lie on the people, either your industry or the people who are employed by you. This is an unfortunate trap we've always fallen. Because when we have a low tax recovery, the government will have to try to do something. हम ही बैठ के बताएंगे यार ये कर दो, OICCI वाले शराबत से दे देंगे. वो तो 5% बढ़ा दो, दे देंगे, वो क्या करेंगे? So एक दो अखबारों में बयान देंगे, इसके बाद दे देंगे. You know, that's the point. But the question is, unless and until you touch upon the basic issue, basic gaps, where the gaps are, you will not be able to recover substantial amount of money. That is, in my view, the biggest issue in this country which need to be sorted out. Next, आगे चलो. ये मैं बात आपका कमिस का इशू है. I don't want to discuss on that. Next, छोड़ दे. आगे चले. Next, आगे छोड़. और आगे चलो. Positive effects भी हैं इकोनॉमी के अंदर, but that's not my subject. Next. देखिए, अनडॉक्यूमेंटेड इकोनॉमी का जो एक्सपेक्ट है टैक्सेशन में, वो बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट है. वो पूरा आपका मनी मार्केट को मैनेज कर रहा है. पूरे पाकिस्तान में एक इकोनॉमी चल रही है जो कि मनी मार्केट एक चल रही है, जो कि आपको फाइनेंस करती है, जो आपको करती है. वो पूरा सर्कल इस इकोनॉमी से बाहर है. और एवरी पीपल आर बीइंग ल्यूर्ड. हम सब जाते हैं, जब प्लॉट खरीदते हैं, हम अपनी मनी को व्हाइट को ब्लैक करते हैं. हम सब जाके अपनी मनी व्हाइट को ब्लैक करते हैं. प्लॉट लेते हैं, 2 करोड़ रुपए का, 80 लाख का दिखाते हैं. 1 करोड़ 20 लाख को हम बैठ के, अलीम साहब बैठ के सोचते हैं, अब 1 करोड़ 20 लाख व्हाइट को ब्लैक कैसे करना है, वो रसीद नहीं दे रहा है. We all know about it. So there is an other side of economy which we all involved, indirectly or directly. So that has to be taken care of. And that economy is also affecting the dollar rate, whether we agree or not. Next. अब मैं उस दिन सब बात कर रहा था एक छोटे से एक सेशन में कि हमें 800 बिलियन कलेक्ट करना है एडिशनल. देखिए, अगर हमारा कलेक्शन आज 1500 बिलियन है, अगर हम 800 ऐड कर दें तो हमारे 90% मसाइल हल हो जाएंगे. 800 बिलियन की अमाउंट है जो कि हमें कलेक्ट करनी है नेक्स्ट ईयर में, या नेक्स्ट ईयर में. यस, 800 ज्यादा है, आप 700 कर लें. 700 अगर आप ऐड कर लेते हैं 1600 में, विदाउट टैक्सिंग पीपल हु आर ऑलरेडी बीइंग टैक्स्ड, देन यू कैन गेट आउट ऑफ दिस विशियस सर्कल. जी, what you're saying, Mr. Jima? And I have tried to identify some of the sectors which the figures may be wrong, right, maybe some of exaggeration, but places where I can feel the money is there. One is the collection from trade in agriculture produce RTs. इसमें जगह है बहुत ज्यादा, बहुत जगह है. इस मिडिल मार्केट में बहुत स्पेस है. अभी थोड़े दिन पहले आरतीस को टैक्स करने की कोशिश की गई थी. सारे पंजाब की फैक्ट्री मंडियों में हड़ताल हो गई. सब्जी मंडी, फ्रूट की मंडी, जितनी भी मंडियां हैं, इनमें कोई आड़ती 1 पैसे का टैक्स नहीं देता. Not a single penny is being paid. They are the reason of the inflation, they are the reason of hoarding, they are the reason of almost all the big financial economic crimes which are being done. 100 बिलियन से 80 बिलियन का मार्जिन इनके अंदर मौजूद है. Unfortunately, I am sitting on the advisory council. FBR has not taken ever any single point agenda to tax them. उनको वो समझते हैं वो पाकिस्तान का हिस्सा ही नहीं है. Retailers is another sector where you can get the money. मैं ज्यादा नहीं बात करता, another sector where you can get the money. अब वन ट्रांजिट ट्रेड को अगर हम करेक्ट कर लें, जो हम नहीं कर रहे, तो we can resolve two issues. If we make a condition that a one transit trade will only be moving through railways. अब्दुल्ला साहब जानते हैं इस बात को. We have कराची से जाती थी मालगाड़ियां 16, अब जाती हैं सिर्फ 3. There is a transporter mafia who is working against all these things. A one transit trade, if it's done by railway, you will clear a one transit trade as well as you will revive railway. So it's a dual-edged system. Railway can never be privatized. It has to be made economically viable by improving the cargo system. Next slide, next. वही slide थी. Then we have to tax on value addition of, ये हमने कर दिया, अब्दुल्ला साहब मैं इत्तेफाक से उसमें इन्वॉल्व थे, जो जीरो रेट सेक्टर था उस पर RGST का अब वो खत्म हो गया और पहले से 50 बिलियन लिखा है. अब्दुल्ला साहब मेरा ख्याल है 30 से 40-50 बिलियन आ जाएगा इसमें, जो हमने किया था जीरो रेट वाला. हाँ 40. व्हाट आई एम सेइंग, ये जीरो रेट सेक्टर को खत्म कर दिया, ऑलरेडी हो गया है. तो जीरो रेट सेक्टर खत्म हो गया. आप जो लॉन की सारा दिन लॉन बिकती थी बाजारों में, आप देखते थे लॉन की, और इसमें औरतें लड़ाई एक दूसरे को कत्ल करती थी, वो सब टैक्स फ्री था. दे आर ऑल टैक्स फ्री. इट वाज एग्जेम्प्ट, टेक्निकली एग्जेम्प्ट. नाउ इट हैज बीन टैक्स एट द 4% ऑफ रिटेल प्राइस. कत्ल हो जाते थे. Now, and some of my friends who are sitting here may not like this statement. Some form of modified wealth tax, Mr. Jumma. And correction on the underpricing and smuggling, and taxation on outward remittances for exchange is discussed. Then coming to provincial taxes, which Isha Saab was referring, we have never concentrated on provincial taxation. We have never concentrated on local body taxation. We are trying to concentrate only on federal government taxation. Provincial government taxation, agriculture tax implementation is a very essential part. It's a levy already levied. The tax is already levied, tax is already there. There are certain lacunas with the law that can generate money. It's not a big issue. Then tax on provincial services which are exempt, GST, they have to be taxed by provinces and they have to be done. Then we have to tax on real estate capital gains. Why not? It's a provincial tax. Then we have to tax on real estate and rental income, which are heavily under declared. Then we have to tax, rightly being as you said by Isha Saab, urban immovable property tax जो है हमारा, वो मजाक बना हुआ है. उसकी रिकवरी इज ऑलमोस्ट लाइक अ जोक. जो अर्बन इमूवेबल प्रॉपर्टी टैक्स है उसकी रिकवरी तो कुछ भी नहीं है. You know, this is a place where you can get the money. Then on a district level, you know, आपने सारे कराची की दीवारें गंदी की हुई हैं, उसे कम से कम दीवार गंदी करने का टैक्स तो ले लें. You know, the hoardings, you know, Mustafa Kamal started and Namadullah started to get money from the hoardings and got a lot of money. So there are many sources of revenues lying with the local body. They are not concentrating on that. And there are other things. What I am saying, all these assertions I have said, does not give any indirect taxation and does not tax the poor. The question is, and this is all incremental, what I am trying to say is that these are all doable things. But unfortunately, when we go for taxation things, reforms, we go for a different tangent and we should go on those tangent, I don't deny that, but concentrate on the loopholes where your money is now going in the drains. Next. Solutions में आपने देखा मैंने RGST को काट दिया. नेक्स्ट मेरा सजेशन ये है कि हमें इंडिजिनस फुल्ली इन्फॉर्म इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसी बनानी पड़ेगी. बट आई एम सेइंग फुल्ली इन्फॉर्म. अनफॉर्चुनेटली, वेरी अनफॉर्चुनेटली, जो डिसीजन मेकर्स हैं, मेरी तजुर्बा थोड़ा ज्यादा है, मेरे हिसाब से डिसीजन मेकर्स के पास रियल ग्राउंड इकोनॉमिक्स की स्टडी बहुत कमजोर है. आप मुझे बताएं पाकिस्तान की कितने एकेडमिक्स ने आज तक, ईशा साहब अभी रिसेंटली आए, कितने एकेडमिक्स ने टेस्ट के ऊपर एक लोकल स्टडी की है? हाउ मेनी पीपल हैव डन अ स्टडी कि हाउ द सुतर मंडी इन फैसलाबाद वर्क्स? How many people have done a study how the Judia Bazaar in Karachi works, how this Khanani Kalia works? You know, we don't have indigenous homegrown knowledge to tax. अगर हम वहां से लेकर आएंगे और फिर उसको यहाँ अप्लाई करेंगे, नहीं होगा, नहीं होगा, नहीं होगा, क्योंकि हमें लोकल नॉलेज ही नहीं है. Secondly, I have used the word bury the desire of RGST implementation in idealistic form. इस desire को दफन कर दें, ये politically sellable नहीं है. And go for realistic mechanism as has been done in the case of zero rated tax sector. अगर आपका ये डिजायर है कि आप 2012-13 में या 13-14 में कोई रेवेन्यू जनरेट कर लेंगे आरजीएसटी से बाय हैविंग एन आइडियलिस्टिक इनपुट आउटपुट बेस्ड सिस्टम, देन इट मे बी गुड, वेरी गुड फॉर मी. मेरी तो बिलिंग बढ़ जाएगी, आप लोग सारे मेरे पास आ जाएंगे एज ए क्लाइंट, बट रेवेन्यू नहीं बढ़ेगा, क्योंकि वो उसके लिए हमें बहुत अभी एक एफर्ट करना है. गो इन स्टेप वाइज पोजीशन. आरजीएसटी का जो सिस्टम है उसको एक रियलिस्टिक, अगेन आई एम सेइंग रियलिस्टिक मैनर में, जिस तरह जीरो रेट पे किया गया है उस तरह करना होगा. एंड देन लास्टली लेवल प्लेइंग फील्ड ऑफ टैक्सेशन, एज मिस्टर अब्दुल्ला वाज सेइंग कि आज एवरी काइंड ऑफ इनकम irrespective of whatever the source is has to be taxed. And lastly, I would say people may not agree, we have got windows open in our society, in our tax law, where we can write in the money. You people, OICCI is not the people, members are not the people who are indulged in those kind of activities, but for the common man sitting in the Bori Bazaar and Judia Bazaar, there are windows open, legal windows open, through which they can write in their money. Unless and until you close those windows, there will be no meaningful incremental taxation in this country. Lastly, coming back to the thing I am saying, anything which we are saying for taxation reform now has to be good for the OICCI for the one reason, because almost all the members of the OICCI are in the documented sector. And anything which goes incremental in increasing the documentation net. That is why I was just saying, and I was just closing my paper. I am coming from Islamabad after presenting my draft paper for the modified wealth tax. But what I am saying, what personally I have suggested is that you impose wealth tax, but not on people who are already paying income tax. Give full credit. Give full credit for income tax against wealth tax, and then any wealth created of untaxed wealth should be taxed. Thank you very much. If you have any question, I will.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zedi, for I think some very, very interesting and practical suggestions. On a bit of a change, of the scene, I think we'll now be requesting Mr. Gareth Aiken to come and speak. Gareth started as a school teacher, but spent most of his career with the DFID, and I got to know him when he was working on behalf of DFID in the High Commission in Islamabad. He's since retired and now returned to Pakistan and is working with the Asia Foundation as a country representative. Amina and I wanted to request him to throw some light on the foreign aid side, the appetite, and look at Pakistan from the point of view of an aid donor. Gareth? Would you like to come here, or you're okay there?
I think I'll be okay here. Thank you. Can everybody hear me reasonably well? Yes. Good. Thank you. Well, thanks very much. It's an honor to be here with so many distinguished speakers today, and I will just give a few thoughts about my perspective. As Moin Saab has said, I actually was out here between 2001 and 2005 heading the DFID office, and now I'm here again. I have been for the last 15 months with the Asia Foundation. And back earlier than that, in 1990 to 93, I wasn't based here, but I was working on the Pakistan program for the British assistance, then called ODA. So this is really my third time coming back to Pakistan. And I'm very pleased to be here. Some people have said, why on earth have you come back? But I find it fascinating and have lots of very good friends here and enjoy the work very much. Now, what I'm going to talk about a little bit, if I can read my notes, I managed to get it all onto one page, so I'll probably get totally mixed up. I'll start with just a little anecdote that happened to me personally before I got into this business. I used to live in Australia when I was in my 20s, and I was coming back via the South Pacific and North America, and I went to Samoa, and I heard a story, if you like, my first international development anecdote, and that was that in a village in Samoa, the Peace Corps had wanted to build toilets or latrines for each house, instead of, the village having a big communal latrine somewhere in the center of the village. They said it would be more hygienic, they said it would be better for everybody, they wouldn't have to go so far. But when they built these latrines for each house, they found that even grandmothers with bad legs were prepared to hobble all the way to the communal latrine rather than using the one that was attached to their particular family residence. Why was this? Well, it was a classic example of where a technical solution doesn't work on its own. What the Peace Corps had failed to realize was that going every day to the communal latrine was not merely satisfying your physical or biological needs, but it was satisfying your needs for exchanging gossip and discussing with your neighbors and, generally generally having a good social interchange. So I won't go so far as to say that it was that anecdote that decided me to move into development when I got back to the UK, but it's a good example of how not only how a technical solution on its own doesn't necessarily deliver the goods, but how, in fact, the history of international development often seems to be, putting the apparent problem into a wider and wider and wider context. Because development is about, basically understanding how to bring about change. And to do that, of course, one has to get to grips not only with technical aspects, but also institutional issues, issues of governance, cultural issues, if you like, because, there are plenty of anecdotes about how people have been consulted, and it turns out that, of course, the men have given their views and the women haven't been consulted and, have got rather different views about what should be done in village. So just very briefly, the changing nature of development assistance. When I came out, or when I visited for DFID or ODA, Overseas Development Administration as it was known then, first to Pakistan in 1990, British aid was very much focused on, in Sindh in fact, largely on water and power. So those are the days when Britain helped to rehabilitate the Sucker and Kotri barrages and work on the left bank outfall drain and all those large irrigation programs, and we had a lot of contact with WAPTA and so on. But we were beginning to get involved with the social sectors, and in fact there was an effort made by the British government to try to get the Pakistani government interested in things like education and health, or interested in it as far as developing projects to make to improve education and health, to make the impact rather better. And other donors were interested, and in the mid to late 90s, that was the time of the World Bank-led Social Action Program. which was again an attempt to, you know, try to get development assistance money into the social sectors. And on the whole, it may have had some successes, but on the whole that was regarded as a failure for a number of reasons. The government of Pakistan seemed to be more interested, you know, in infrastructure than in the social sectors. There were many other factors, no doubt, and I think the general view was that didn't fully succeed. Later on, of course, the Millennium Development Goals, which have been cited once or twice this morning, became the rallying cry for development assistance. And back in the early years of this century, the PRSP, the Poverty Reduction Strategy paper that every government, or program that every government was supposed to have, became the focus as a government plan around which donors would, you know, provide assistance in part of a coherent government-led plan. And that of course, I mean, that has tended to fade away a bit. But it's interesting that it was focused on poverty reduction. Now, there has always been a debate about, you know, how does one best reduce poverty? Does one reduce poverty by channeling funds and effort into education, into health, into creating jobs and so forth? Or does one rely on economic growth and that generating enough money in the economy, which then can be applied to those areas? And it wouldn't be, obviously both have to go together. I mean, there's got to be money. You can't rely entirely on donor assistance. But if you rely entirely on indigenous growth, Pakistan does not have a very good record of this growth being distributed very widely among the population. So, and at the moment, of course, we don't particularly have either much growth going on, or indeed very much government-led plans on a large scale to redistribute or to push money into the social sectors. We heard, for example, that, you know, less than between 1% and 2% spent on education, for example. So the Millennium Development Goals are going to be largely missed, and a lot has been said about that, which I won't repeat, except to emphasize that compared to other South Asian countries, Pakistan's performance, unless things change dramatically before 2015, will fall quite a lot short compared to some of our neighbors, and I don't just mean India. Now, development assistance is perhaps you know, what exactly is it? Why should one country help another? When I got into the business, I was told it's basically an interest, basically a mixture of, you know, humanitarian, if you're, or not humanitarian in the disaster sense, but if one is better off, one shares, a mixture of that and a kind of self-interest. You know, if you give them money, they'll be your friends and therefore they will do what you want. I think that has in many ways evolved, although you might say that the concept of what that means has evolved, though you might say that it's still largely about self-interest on the part of the donor. But going back to my Samoan anecdote and the, if you like, placing what it means to solve a problem in a larger and larger context, most donors try to see the world not only in terms of their own national self-interest, but also in terms of a more holistic approach. You know, what is good for the world, and how does that relate to what they might do? And of course, in the case of Pakistan, there are lots of reasons for, I mean, in the case of Britain, for example, there are all sorts of issues to do with terrorism and drugs and nuclear proliferation and so forth, that would be considerably eased if Pakistan is in fact fully stable, equitable, peaceful and prosperous country. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of history, but I'd like to say something about some aspects of what the donor scene, particularly the bilateral donor scene, looks like today, in my view, and I may be a little partial in picking out certain things rather than others, but it is a very wide and complex topic. First of all, I'd like to say something about aid and conditionality. I said earlier that, donors always have something of a self-interested motive, even if it's seen in terms of creating a better world for all of us to live in. But they do expect, in some way, not necessarily a return to their country in terms of their investment, but they do want to see something achieved. And in recent years, there has obviously, when a development project or program gets developed with the government of Pakistan or with the provincial government, then what do they expect from that? And the word conditionality means, what conditions, if you like, are you putting on it? Now, one feature at the moment, which I think you can notice particularly in terms of British aid or American aid, is that there is quite a lot of opposition in those countries from voices who are saying, why should we give money to Pakistan? What are we getting for it? I won't go into all the whole business of, whose war it is and all that kind of thing. But on a more local level, take, for example, education. There was an article 10 days ago in one of the UK Sunday papers by a woman called Christina Lamb. She's not an economic or development expert, but she's what you might call an informed popular writer. And she was saying that when the British Prime Minister came out here a couple of weeks back and promised, several hundred million UK assistance to Pakistan to help in education, she was saying, well, is this, why should Britain do this? Because questioning, that Pakistan should perhaps make rather more effort. And obviously, what we've heard about lack of investment in education and how many children are out of school today, does make that, a significant point. There is, I think, going to be more pressure on Pakistan, for example, to show that it is delivering its side of the bargain. Perhaps, the fact that there was much less assistance coming from other parts of the world for the floods compared to the earthquake in 2005 may have been another indication that perhaps people are getting skeptical about whether, even a charitable donation is some kind of investment, whether that's the best place to put your money. We've heard a lot this afternoon about tax and the very low take on tax there is here in this country. And this was something that, speaker after speaker said at the Pakistan Development Forum back in, whenever it was, early November, I think, that Pakistan does not raise much tax, again, compared to some of its neighbors. I believe Sri Lanka is about 15%. And Shabir Saab showed, what would be needed to achieve 15% rather than 10%, in his last presentation. So conditionality, the UK, for example, has said that it will increase its aid over, I think, 4 or 5 years from about £215 million this year to 446 in 2015, which is, more than doubling. And Pakistan, it's not only the biggest percentage increase, I think, but it's going to be the biggest program absolutely of British aid at a time when it is in fact cutting down on the number of countries it's serving. But, and here is the catch, but the Prime Minister and others have made it clear that it's going to depend on reforms being undertaken here by the Pakistan government. So it is therefore, there is a very broad conditionality attached. No doubt there'll be some wriggle room. Nobody's defined exactly what that means, but I think everybody knows in broad terms roughly what, that it will not come automatically. And of course you've heard in the US various congressmen getting up saying, we should cut off aid to Pakistan and this and that and the other. And so the American government is under some pressure. Again, I'm sure it will succeed in fighting off that pressure, but that pressure is there, and so it is incumbent, I think, upon Pakistan to make the taxpayers of other countries feel that they're getting their money's worth. The second thing that I would say, I've mentioned conditionality. Donors nowadays are much more, they're much tougher than they used to be on measurable results and getting outcomes. I mean, in a conventional, if you're building a bridge or if you're rehabilitating the Kotri barrage or something, you can see what it is that you get. It either works or it doesn't, and you can work out mathematically and economically, what your rates of return are and so forth. Donors in recent years have got much more into these areas like institution building, capacity building, governance, and so forth, and community development. And this is an attempt, as I say, to move away from the technical solution and to try and capture more and more of the environment that influences the success or failure of the project or program. But it comes, of course, the more you get away from literally concrete things like barrages and roads and so forth, the more difficult it becomes to measure your success or failure. And I think perhaps for a long time we comforted ourselves with saying, the community is more, more confident in itself, more women are coming to meetings, this kind of thing, or that, there's greater democratization, or people have a greater understanding of their rights. And these things can be measured to some extent, but speaking from the Asia Foundation point of view as an organization which has got a small amount of its own money, but relies on the bilaterals, we are implementing and taking forward, and as well as designing many programs with bilateral support. We can see that people, again, particularly the Americans, the British, are really insisting on very specific results. So that, for example, in order to get some funding for a major democratization program that we are working on, we've had to, for example, try to find out how much it actually costs to get a woman in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa registered to vote, compared to how much it costs in Bangladesh or in this or that Indian state. So donors, you might say sometimes even unrealistically, are trying to pin down the value of their dollar or pound or euro or whatever it is. Okay, did other people get past this as well? I'm sorry if I'm a little bit slow. I'm just coming to an end. So there's a much higher bar in terms of success, and their development does get more and more difficult, and of course no project works unless there's cooperation from the government. Just finally, if I can beg one more minute, I wanted to say something about coherence, another key word that you hear. Again, pursuing this theme of widening what development is, development can't be seen in isolation. Development, if you like, is a temporary expedient. in the end, the country is going to have to develop its own indigenous resources and not rely on other countries, not certainly in terms of conventional development assistance. And trade, of course, is one of the ways out of being a development recipient. Lots of donors talk about public-private partnerships and working with the private sector and so forth. And I must say I haven't seen a huge amount of this compared to the conventional approaches, but that is the way ahead, I think, in terms of Pakistan developing its own resources, which it can then apply to solve its own problems. One way, of course, in which the outside world can help in the short term is to try to work on the kinds of conditions that will foster or enable trade. For example, obviously, the legal sector, if there are disputes in trade, can they be solved quickly, or will they stay in the courts for years and years? Security is another example where assistance can sometimes be provided. But it is only assistance. At the core of this, there is, in fact, the government or the governments in Pakistan and Pakistan civil society who have got to really set the pace here. So my last sentence will be really, while governments may complain that donors often, influence them and run aspects that they don't want to be run, I see it as rather the other way around. I think donors would have a lot less influence if government and the agencies of Pakistan society would take charge and set the kind of vision for what they want and come up with the kinds of action plans and so on that donors would happily assist in. So if there is the accusation that donors are too influential and are running things too much, then I think it really is up to Pakistan to come together and identify what it wants itself and take things forward. Thank you very much, and sorry if I've slipped a little bit over my time.
Gareth, thank you very much. No, in fact, I think you covered some of the issues which were of concern extremely well.
Thank you.
And I think it goes without saying that a country with its own strong program will always attract donors rather than run after donors. Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming close to the end of the session. Our second but last speaker is Dr. Akmal. I introduced him in the morning. He's one of our eminent economists in Pakistan. This morning he spoke brilliantly about the SAARC aspects of trade and the importance of the SAARC relationship. We would now like him to say a few words about the macroeconomic issues facing Pakistan.
Thank you, Moin. You can judge from the generosity of Moin's introduction that he's an old friend, so you can deflate it downwards a little. Mr. Chairman, colleagues on the panel, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, a more fundamental way of looking at the problem of growth, stabilization, and poverty. And to see this fundamental perspective in terms of creating the basis of a better future for the people of this country. What I hope to do, we can stop that for the moment because it's a distraction, distracting the audience. If you can just switch the thing off. What I hope to do in this very brief presentation is to bring some cutting-edge new concepts in economic growth, which have emerged over the last 2 decades or so, principally by people like the Nobel Prize winning Douglas C. North and his colleagues, and bring these new concepts of institutions and growth to bear on the Pakistani case and see how we can get out of this recurrent bind that we get into of high growth followed by very low rates of growth, and acute balance of payments pressures, acute fiscal pressures, and rising poverty. Well, it's very clear that we're in a kind of double bind situation, and this is not the first time we've been here. It's a double bind situation in the sense that we are in a deep recession, rising poverty, which is threatening the society and state itself. And on the other hand, we have a government which has an extremely restricted fiscal space and is really not really in a position to financially produce the kind of stimulus package which could jumpstart the economy. Now, each of these two elements of the present sort of double bind situation, in my view, is located in the structure of the growth process that we have been following in the past. And therefore, the solutions do not lie, in my view, in the kind of quick fix solutions that our economists and policymakers are doing. The solution lies in a fundamental change in the structure and institutional framework of the growth process. The word structure has been misused by the International Monetary Fund, if I may say so. I will refer to the word structure in its more rigorous sense, which is that structure refers to the design features of an economy which determine the pattern and pace of economic growth. Okay, now let's start with the first provocation. I'm going to give you a series of provocations. The institutional framework of the Pakistan economy, and indeed its structure, is designed to enrich the elite and enable the elite to participate as subjects of the growth process on the basis of systematically excluding the majority of the people as subjects of the growth process. By subjects of the growth process, I mean to be able to participate in investment and high wage employment. And it is precisely on the basis of this exclusion that the elite is able to generate large unearned incomes, or rents as we call them in economics. Now, the literature shows that the kind of pattern of growth that Pakistan has been following in the last 60 years or so is indeed typical of the underdeveloped world. The pattern of growth we've been following is that when large capital inflows are available, we generate high rates of growth, relatively high rates of growth, 5 to 6%. And when these large capital inflows, for whatever reason, dry up, our growth rates and per capita income growth rates become zero or even negative. This stop-go pattern of growth is in fact the typical feature of what can now be called not developing countries but undeveloped countries. Angus Madison, who is a great economic historian, has now produced data, global data, as between developed and undeveloped countries for the last 1,000 years. And I'd like to show you the first table, just again by way of provocation, which shows the per capita GDP of developed and the undeveloped world in the period 1000 AD to 1998. You find that in the year 1000 AD, the average per capita income for what is today the developed world was in fact less than the average per capita income of what is today called the underdeveloped or undeveloped world. 405 international dollars at 1990 prices, $405 in the year 1000 AD for the first group of countries, the developed ones, and as high as $440 for the undeveloped countries. The ratio between the two, between the developed and undeveloped, in fact, is less than 1. Now you find that by the year 1500, the next 500 years, the tables turn in terms of the relative economic fortunes of these two sets of countries. 704 for the developed and only 535 for the undeveloped. And then this gap explodes over the next 500 years almost, so that by the year 1998, The average for the developed countries is almost 6.9 times that of the undeveloped countries. Now the question that one can pose is, what is the fundamental set of factors which explain this rather dramatic change of relative fortunes between these two sets of countries? Now the evidence, the data shows, and a lot of work has been done, both case studies and as well as cross-country studies. The literature shows that these two sets of countries have very different patterns of growth. That's the first level at which to understand the difference. That the developed countries are able to sustain their per capita income growth over long periods of time, whereas the undeveloped countries grow in spurts, stop, go, stop, go. They have high per capita incomes during certain periods, which are then the gains are neutralized in the subsequent periods of slow growth. So the question for the policy makers, in a sense, policy makers who want to bring about a structural change, if you like, is what set of factors will shift Pakistan's economic structure from one that grows in spurts to one where growth can be sustained over long periods of time. Because it's only a long-term sustained economic growth that can transform the conditions of life of the majority of the people rather than only a small elite. There again, the literature is very clear. As far as economic science is concerned, over the last 2 decades, we have a huge volume of literature to prove. People like Grief have looked at countries since the Middle Ages, individual case studies, and they've demonstrated that the fundamental factor that determines whether you are able to sustain your growth or whether you grow in spurts is the institutional framework within which growth occurs. Now again, the word institutions is bandied about and loosely used, unfortunately, in our economic discourse. But when we're talking about growth, we refer to the word institutions. An institution is essentially a set of rules, formal or informal. And these rules embody incentives and disincentives for individual and firm behavior. So in other words, the evidence shows that in the case of the developed countries, they were able to come up with a set of rules, if you like, which contained incentives for increasing efficiency, for introducing innovations, for high levels of competition, for selection based on merit. It's that institutional structure which generated these features on the basis of which they were able to grow over long periods of time. The developed countries have what we can call an open access economy. Their rules are such that you don't have to belong to the elite, you don't have to be some important person's cousin or uncle to be able to enter as a captain of industry. Anybody can enter the economy, and whoever doesn't perform has to leave. There are no subsidies available, no bank write-offs available, right? So in other words, you have a very broad base of competition, and it's on the basis of the fact that a much larger number of people are competing that you have greater efficiency, greater increase in productivity growth, greater innovation. It's simply the fact of sustained growth arises simply out of a set of incentives or rules on the basis of which people apply themselves as a matter of survival to increase efficiency, productivity, and innovation. You know, somebody asked Bill Gates, you got so much money, man, why are you continuing to make more money? He said, if I didn't, I'll lose what I have. That's the point. Okay, by contrast, countries such as ours have an institutional framework which is carefully designed, systematically designed to provide rents for the elite in the form of subsidies, in the form of pricing of various public services, in the form of access over markets or capital or goods or inputs, specialized access over or preferential access even over public services such as health and high quality education. Our institutional framework is designed, in fact, to restrict competition, to exclude the majority of the people from the process of growth and governance. And it is on the basis of this exclusion that you have a much more restricted competition. And this set of rules, therefore, produces a particular kind of firm and a particular kind of individual behavior. You then have a textile industry emerging after years of consuming a large proportion of our GDP in the form of subsidies, which produced relatively negative value added in large periods of history. It didn't have the capacity for exports. It did not diversify into high value added products. It was not willing to take risk. The captains of industry were getting to office at 11 o'clock in the morning and reaching the club at 1 o'clock after 2 hours of work and spending the rest of the afternoon playing golf. Well, they did that because that was a rational response. It was a rational response to the incentive structure that was created. You didn't have to work hard or take risks or to innovate to survive. All you needed to do was to be on the right side of the government. And you'd get the subsidies. You'd get the preferential treatment. Okay? Now, unfortunately, the chickens have come home to roost. We have a major, as somebody pointed out, Dr. Lakha pointed out this morning, we have a major internal violence problem. And my submission, ladies and gentlemen, is that you might use the military to defeat the Taliban in the short term, but unless you change the structure of the economy and enable a much larger number of people to participate in the growth process, poverty is going to remain endemic, and therefore violence by non-state actors will continue even after the people are defeated in the short term. Okay. Now, what kind of change do we specifically need in the Pakistani case? I agree with the Hussain that the short-term agenda is all the good things that he's talked about. You know, try to control the fiscal deficit, stabilize the economy, but it's not going to be the precursor, as he puts it, of high growth. It may be the precursor of growth for a short period of time, but we'll be back to square one very quickly, as history shows us. We need to change the institutional structure of the economy such that investment in the growth process, competition, and high wage employment becomes accessible to all of the people rather than a small elite. That's the opening up that we need. Not simply liberalization. We have to redefine the terms. Opening up means enabling all of the citizens of Pakistan to lead a life of dignity rather than just a few. Okay. Now, there are three kinds of specific initiatives that can be undertaken to launch a new kind of growth process, to create a new structure of a new kind of growth process. And very quickly I will propose to you the basis of this new approach is that so far we have had growth with inequality. Most undeveloped countries, including India, by the way, today, even today, believe that, growth inevitably generates inequality, and it's a function of the state to ameliorate this inequality by using revenues for public sector expenditures designed to help growth. Well, what I would propose, and I've said this in a seminar where Professor Amartya Sen was present, and I proposed that what we need is to build equity into the growth process itself. Beyond that, in fact, we need equity will become a means of higher and more sustained growth. In what sense do we mean that equity will become a means for a higher and more sustained growth? By that we mean that we begin to involve the middle class and the poor as subjects of the growth process. Give them access over investable resources, over high quality education, high quality health, so that the middle class and the poor can engage in both high wage employment, in productivity increases, and in investment. It's by broadening the base of growth that you will have more equitable growth, and precisely because it's more equitable, you'll be able to have a higher and more sustained growth. You'll simply be able to draw upon a larger reservoir of talent and investable resources. Okay, now what are the specific initiatives that can be undertaken? The first is, I would propose that the government, according to the data that I received from during the previous government from the Ministry of Labor and Manpower, is that there are 2.4 million acres of state land available. They're cultivable, 2.4 million acres. My suggestion is that we divide these into 5-acre lots and distribute them to the landless tenants. When you look at the agriculture census data, you find that over 60% of the total farm area is in the hands of farmers who are less than 25-acre operators. A large proportion of these operators, farmers, are tenants who have neither the incentive nor the ability to increase yields. If you give them land ownership, they'll have both the incentive as well as the ability to increase their yields. This, of course, has to be backed up by what I've called a small farmer development corporation, which provides support to the small farmers in terms of introducing new technologies, well, drip farming or whatever, to be able to diversify into higher value added crops and to get better access over the markets for inputs and outputs. So that's the first thing. This is part of what we can call a new elite. Instead of having an elite farmer strategy as in the past, we have a small farmer based growth strategy in the future. The second suggestion is to increase or tap into the tremendous talent and potential that we have in the small and medium-sized manufacturing sector, particularly automobile and metallurgical industry. I've interviewed about, I think, 1,200 such small operators, and I was amazed at the talent that they have. They can produce calibrating instruments with the lathe machines, but those calibrating instruments are sitting up there as trophies, and instead they're producing low value added taps and window shuttering. The point is to be able to link the small and medium sized sector on an outsourcing basis, on a vending basis with the large scale manufacturing sector. It's only then that they'll be able to produce high value added components. But in order for them to supply these orders, they need to be given, they need three things quickly. They need forging facilities, heat treatment facilities, surface treatment, quality control, which can be provided by common facility centers. One such center already exists in southern Punjab, in Chunia. We need many more of these common facility centers, which become the institutional basis of the small farms, of the small manufacturing sector taking off. The third proposal is that, we keep imagining the poor or conceiving of the poor as people who produce little micro enterprise stuff, daris and chabris and, plastic items. How about mainstreaming the poor? How about involving the poor in your mainstream large scale sector for manufacturing and the services? How about creating a corporation, for example, which produces and exports milk and dairy products? A corporation which is entirely owned by the poor peasants, but which is run by professionals. Now, there's nothing new in this idea. Amul tried it in India. Amul is now the world's largest producer and exporter of milk and milk products. The world's largest, and it's entirely owned by poor peasant women. 7 million women own Amul. Similarly, we have the Grameen Telecom. The Grameen Telecom in Bangladesh is the largest service provider, if you like, for telecommunications. It's entirely owned by poor peasants in Bangladesh, but run by professionals. There's a whole range of such corporate enterprises, if you like, owned and operated, owned by the poor, operated by professionals. Now let's think in terms of a public-private partnership, part of corporate social responsibility, part of setting the country on the right path of sustained growth, of building these large corporations with equity stakes for the poor and which run with efficiency and which compete against the best other such corporate enterprises. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, all that I'm saying is that this country does not have a bright future if we monopolize this country for the rich and exclude the majority of the people from a life of dignity and participation in growth. It's a kind of economic apartheid which can't be sustained. Solving the double bind situation that we have today, please let us desist from quick fixes. Let's think fundamentally in terms of changing the institutional structure within which a new kind of growth process takes place. A growth process where equity, in fact, becomes a means of sustaining growth. A growth structure in which all of the people of this country become citizens in the economic sense of the term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akmal. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the end of the session and the last of our speakers, Mr. Paul Ross from the IMF. The International Monetary Fund, of course, is sometimes understood, but often misunderstood. I myself, when I was in government, worked for nearly 15 years with the IMF and had a very high regard for the quality of the people who worked with the fund. They were always very high quality professionals and technocrats, as we might call them, in their own areas. And Paul is one of those. He worked with Warburgs before joining the fund about 25 years ago, and since then has worked apart from the main IMF in Washington, in Indonesia, Russia, Turkey, Egypt, and has now been in Pakistan for a couple of years. Paul, we'd like you to give us a bit of a view on how you see things, how the fund is seeing things, and maybe also give us some insights into what's happening in Washington.
Can't see that far. Thank you very much, Roy. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you very much, Ms. Saeed, for inviting me, and to the Chamber, who also here, and so distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk a little bit about Pakistan and the IMF, although sitting here this afternoon, I've heard a lot about the IMF already, so I don't have a lot to add. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. Anyway, look, first of all, what do we do? There's a lot of discussion about what the IMF does. It's very transactional. And we do more than just transactions in terms of giving speeches and coming to seminars. There are three main functions that we try and do, and let me try and link it a bit to the work that we do in Pakistan. One is we do what we call global surveillance, where we try and look at the state of the world economy and the outlook for the world economy, and what are the issues and trends in the world economy and how they affect not just the overall economy, but then individual economies. We have a couple of flagship publications, the World Economic Outlook and the Global Financial Stability Report, that twice a year provide a sort of comprehensive and global view of what's going on in the world's economies and financial markets and how they're interacting, and the challenges and opportunities that they present, both for the world economy and for the individual countries that make up the world economy that are our members. In addition, we do something we call regional surveillance. So, for example, we do a product that looks at issues in each of the 5 regions into which we divide the world. And for Pakistan, we have a region that includes the Middle East and North Africa, Central Asia, the Caucasus, as well as Pakistan and Afghanistan. And we look at the issues that affect those countries. Often we divide those countries into 3 groups for analysis of regional trends: oil importers, which includes Pakistan; oil exporters, which there are many in the Gulf and some in North Africa; and then the countries of the Caucasus and Central Asia, which have a slightly different economic history and are still subject to some different trends. A second area, which is the one where I think we tend to get into the news most, for good or for bad, is lending. When countries have balance of payments problems or disequilibria, sometimes they request financial assistance from the IMF. And the IMF provides that financial assistance, usually in support of programs that countries themselves devise that seek to address fairly quickly the imbalances that those countries face. For example, the one that Pakistan has today with the IMF that started in 2008. Now, the third thing that we do is institution building, which touches a little bit on what Dr. Akmal says. Where we have some comparative advantage in knowledge, we try and provide institution building services through technical assistance in areas of fiscal management, so say tax policy and tax administration. Mr. Yusuf was a counterpart of many such missions. Also central banking issues and macroeconomic statistics. Further, we provide training for government officials that work in ministries of finance or ministries of economy, statistics bureau, central banks, tax agencies. Fourth, we publish an awful lot about what we do. It's one of the innovations that we learned late, but over the past dozen years I think we've developed one of the most comprehensive websites of information about economics, macroeconomics and open economics. And for example, on Pakistan, you can find hundreds of documents that reflect the work that the IMF staff has done, statements given by the government, statements given by other member countries about Pakistan, and so forth. And I would urge you that if you're interested about the IMF and Pakistan, or just the IMF, or just Pakistan, please go and have a look at www.imf.org, and there's a page there called Pakistan and the IMF. There's a lot of information. Many of the questions that I receive, or misconceptions that I sometimes try and rectify, show that people haven't had the opportunity to have a look at that website and the information that's there. So, now, Pakistan, as you all know, has been a member of the IMF for a very long time, almost since the IMF's creation, and is a member in good standing. And that over the past 30 years or so, there have been a number of IMF programs with Pakistan, some successful, some less so. I think probably for about 25 years or so, out of the last 30, the Pakistan has been under an IMF program in some form, sometimes off track, sometimes on track. Now, I'd like to quickly talk about what's going on in the current program. As you probably know, that in 2008 there was a new agreement whereby the IMF agreed to provide financial assistance to support a program of the Pakistan government and the State Bank of Pakistan. The amount was originally about $7.5 billion and a duration of 2 years. Subsequently, the amount was increased to about $11 billion, and the length of the arrangement was extended to about 34 months. And of the $11 billion, about $7.5 billion have been dispersed. In addition, last year, following the floods, the IMF dispersed an additional $450 million as emergency assistance to help with the humanitarian efforts and needs after the floods. I think that now, going forward, we remain closely engaged with the government and the State Bank. We take our cues from them, and we offer our opinions on how we see the economy, what the challenges are that we see, and we offer feedback on policies that the government's thinking about implementing or is implementing. Where we see success, we note it. Where we see shortfalls or discrepancies, we try and come up with suggestions that will be useful to try and get back to the objectives that there are for the economy, which after all are to develop and grow this economy. And I think we've heard from others today, everybody on this panel has come up with a number of ideas about how to ensure successful development and growth in Pakistan. And I think that many of the ideas expressed by my co-panelists we subscribe to and would agree with, but perhaps not all. But we do find Pakistan at the moment in an awkward situation. The floods have really dented growth in the economy. Inflation is stuck up and high. And I think that, as a number of other speakers have said, Pakistan needs to break out of this high inflation and low growth situation. And I think that as we work with Pakistan, one of the prime objectives we will be trying to add to the debate and discussion and thoughts is how to move Pakistan onto a high growth trajectory. There are many things that can be done, and some of my co-panelists have already discussed what they include. For example, reducing inflation, restoring macroeconomic stability, improving the public finances, injecting better practices in public enterprises, liberalizing the trade regime, improving the investment and business climate through increased competition and more equity. Because I think, as Dr. Akmal says, equity can be increased and there would be huge economic gains from increasing equity. One can see in the tax system it's hugely inequitable, as my colleague Mr. Abdallah mentioned. Also, a lot of the subsidies that are coming from the budget are hugely inequitable. They go to the middle income and to the high income groups, not to the poor. I think that if those resources were better channeled, that would unlock the potential that Pakistan definitely has and help it to attain a high rate of growth, which it badly needs, given the levels of poverty, unemployment, and the youngness of the population. So thank you for listening to me. I think I'll stop there if I may. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm short of my 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Paul. That actually brings us to the question and answer session. A couple of our speakers have to leave for the airport. I think that includes Abdullah Saab, but earlier Dr. Akmal. So if there are any questions, well, he's leaving anyway. So, sir, Mr. Nafiuddin Sheikh.
Thank you. I think this has been an extremely informative panel, particularly for someone who's not an economist. But I found fascinating some elements of Mr. Abdullah Yusuf's presentation and Mr. Zadi's presentation, particularly with regard to Afghan transit trade and the effect it has, and secondly with regard to methodologies for whitening black money. On Afghan transit trade, I think one should bear in mind that we also have imports through Herat, which are Chabahar to Herat down, and they come down to you from Chaman. And I was at a conference in Kabul, and the governor of Herat told me that they collect $200 million as import duty at Herat. And given the usual percentages, I would assume that they should have been collecting $300 million. The rate is 5 to 10%. So I would assume that something in the neighborhood of $4 billion worth of goods were coming in. And the governor finally agreed with me that about 80% of that comes from Pakistan. So you have smuggling of that rate in addition to whatever you do. Second, with regard to Afghanistan, we talk about the fact that we are now 1.2 to 1.4 billion and we hope to be 1.7 billion. I'm really not sure, I'm very cynical about this, as to how much of the building material really goes across. How much of the cement, how much of the steel really goes across, or how much of it is the differential of 15% on the GST. Is it 15 or more? 17. Is that enough of an incentive to keep it where it is with just invoicing? Now, I think these are elements that perhaps would deal same income. And the last thing that struck me was about whitening. Are we really naive enough to believe that at this time remittances are increasing because Pakistanis are earning more abroad? It's not possible. There is a recession. Everybody is screaming about keeping jobs. So here's another source, because you know that this is money going from here and coming back to bite you. I think this sort of identification is easily done, and I think it's easily corrected. There is there is no secret about what happens. I was in Kandahar, and a mile-long convoy of trucks loaded with Indian tires. It wasn't going through unguarded or the uncharted pathways. This was coming across. It had to come across. Those trucks would not be able to take rough passages. These are things that we can and should stop. I was hoping that you might have some comment on whether this is in fact your own perception, your own assessment or not. Thank you.
Well, actually, Sheikh Saab, you're absolutely right. We have this huge historical problem of Khan Transit, and because of geography and then the international commitments, and then of course the manipulations and everything else that goes with it. And this trade has actually substantially increased over the years. At least I know in the last couple of years even, it used to be around 50 billion rupees in 2008, and in 2010 it was 4 times, more than 200 billion. And of course it will go up further, because what happens is whenever you try to do something on the tariff side, and you try to, like I think it was done a couple of years ago, that you increase the tariff on certain non-essential goods, like luxury goods we call them. And what it does is it just transfers that business from the regular trade to the irregular trade, which is the Afghan transit. Because it's that element, there is a cost of smuggling as well. So as long as you are on the border of that cost, you are okay. But once you go beyond that cost, then of course you have much more incentive to go out and smuggle. And your point about it coming from the Iranian border, in any case, Iranian border is comparatively more expensive as opposed to our side. And of course, if they find it not possible or for any reason, difficult to come through our sources, then they do go and use the other alternatives, and then they come back. That is also a reality. Now, the issue which confronts us actually is, and there have been several attempts and efforts on the logistic or the physical side, and there has been even talk of putting up some kind of a fence along the border and things like that, which of course is also not acceptable to the other side for obvious reasons. And even for that matter, the ESAF and other partners, US, etc., they also did not support it, which is rather strange, but still. So physical, the porous border that you have and the length of the border that you have, I think physical patrolling and trying to control that, I don't think is very easy. That will be very difficult. Unless you can put a wall, like now on the Indian side, you have this type of fencing done. But the only way perhaps is possible is through your tariff rationalization. And that is more practical, more workable as opposed to the other measures. Thank you.
I think the only thing I can say about further on Afghan transit trade, this topic 2-3 years ago was a taboo. Nobody talked about it. No, at least we are bringing up this topic at the forums like this, because nobody talked about the real economic impact of the Afghan war we had in. we have always been talking on the military side of the one problem. We have never talked about the economic side of the one problem. And as I said, this is an indigenous issue, and we have to look solution ourselves. And I think when we are bringing up this matter, on the last point of yours about the whitening, it's an issue which again was a taboo. It was never discussed. That provision is existing for last 15 years, almost. And I assume why should people pay tax in Pakistan when they have a very easy mean to whiten the money? So I really assume I'm in tax practice. The question is that we are again in a vicious circle of how to balance the remittance. Because we are always short of dollars, and to tax that remittance issue. So it's a very complicated subject. But what I'm saying that at least when we will discuss it like this in some time to come, we will definitely come up with some solution. At the moment, very frankly, we don't have a solution.
I have a question to Paul Roth and Ishrat Hussain, who would like to answer that. If we project the GDP growth of Pakistan from say 71 to 2009, so we see that to 94, I mean, you have an average growth period of 5.5%. From 94 to say 2009, it's around 4.5% if you exclude that 2003 to 7 period. And given that period, we from 94 onward, we are virtually in IMF program, apart from a year or two. So does it imply that the prescription given by the IMF is not being implemented, or is not working in our favor? Or what are the other things which are hindering to have a low potential of growth? However, as you see the India with a similar demographics, they're growing in a much higher trajectory from say 90 onwards to this last 2 decades.
I'll refer you to a paper which I have just published in Business Review called Pakistan's Growth Experience 1947-2007. I'd like you to read it. It's a research paper, and you will find the difference between India and Pakistan. I have two papers, one 1994 and the other one is 2009. Before 91, India was way behind Pakistan in all indicators, and that was stuck called Hindu rate of growth because it was an inward-looking economy, completely cut off from the rest of the world, commanding heights of the economy, as Mr. Nehru used to say, was controlled by the state. In 1991, Minister Narasimha Rao took the lead under a crisis situation where India had to send its gold in order to get some liquidity. And the world was not believing all the liberalization and deregulation India was going through until Mr. Vajpayee came to power and the BJP continued with the same policies. And the world recognized that there has been a paradigm shift in the whole economic philosophy of India. And the Indians, who were pretty good because of the market size of 1.2 billion people, were quite efficient, were able to take over the rest of the world. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, Mr. Nawaz Sharif started the same policies. But we had political discontinuity, that the policies, even if they were not abandoned, were not pursued because the successor government felt that the credit for this will go to the previous government. So we were our worst enemies. And this lack of continuity of the economic policies. And I have a paper which shows Brazil, China, India, and Pakistan, that three countries have done well because Cardoso started the policies. Lula, who's the leftist of any kind you can think about, continued with the same policies because the confidence of the investors, both in side and outside is the determining factor of investment. And when investment takes place, then you have growth. And this is the reason. It's a non-economic factors, nothing to do with IMF, nothing to do with capital flows. It is the coherence, consistency, and predictability of the economic policies. If I invest money, and these are all OICCI members, they want to assure their headquarters that they would get 20% or 15% rate of return over a period of time. Otherwise, they will get an X. And that is not possible if the economic policies keep on swinging from one extreme to another.
This is to OICCI members and again to Ishad Saab. He's being in academia now. There is a lack of linkage between the academia and the industry in Pakistan to do the quality and timely research which is required. For instance, there is a need of low housing homes in Pakistan. Now, the academia has to do the research what kind of material we be using in the housing and how much is the cost should be that and then should be doing research how this be financed. Okay. And the number of other issues which can be there, like the case which mentioned by Mr. Zaidi on the RT, the middleman. So how to formalize that, how to document that. There has to be need of institutional arrangement between the academia and the industry to do the research.
Research, you need the cooperation of the other side. If I send my students to Jodia Bazaar or I send them to the exchange companies, they will be beaten up because they're asking for information which is absolutely sacrosanct in their hearts. Even their employees do not know what kind of information is. I'm carrying out a survey of organized firms outside the multinational corporations or the public listed companies who publish their numbers. None of the Pakistani companies is willing to share the financial data with my researchers. Now, you cannot have a meaningful research unless the other side is cooperating. We decided in the State Bank of Pakistan to construct a price index of the dwellings or the housing, and it is impossible to construct an index because, as Shabbar pointed out, and I've been writing on this subject, there is so much of understatement and concealment of the values of the property. One for the banks, where they exaggerate the underlying security by 20 times. One for the property offices, where they understate it by 20 times. So when you have such a variation between the values recorded in the bank's books and value recorded in the taxation office, you can't do the research. And I am banging my head, despite the fact that all these people are friends and known to me, despite all my efforts, it's very difficult to get any data. So how can we have linkages between the industry and the academia when the people are just not willing to cooperate?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, since there are no more questions, I've got a bit of good news and bad news for you. The good news is we said we'd finish by 5:30. We will certainly finish by 5:30. The bad news is we will have the tea and coffee after I've said a few words and Amina has thanked you all. So if you bear with us another 10 minutes or so, then we can wind it up. I think we've had an excellent day of discussions on all three areas that we took up today. As I pointed out, our rapporteur, Dr. Kamal, Mr. Kamal Asfar will be preparing a report which with Amina's consent and approval will then be available to the OICCI for distribution to appropriate people in government or whatever. As I said, I mean, we had a number of very distinguished speakers today. I don't need to, I've even making short notes, I've got about 8 pages. I won't go through those. But I would like to highlight at least one critical point made by each speaker, Just to recap on what happened today, in the first session, Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh emphasized the fact that anti-Americanism is high in Pakistan at a time when the US-Pakistan objectives may in fact be very similar, and that is odd and that needs perhaps to be addressed. Dr. Akmal spoke about the importance of SAFTA, saying that as he estimates it, we could add perhaps a 2% annual GDP growth to our normal growth rate by going in for regional trade and free trade. Ambassador Marker pointed out that Pakistan and US are likely to continue to be involved in a close relationship which will have its highs and lows. And he, of course, said that there was need for Pakistan to strengthen its institutions, something a lot of others said, including Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh. Mr. Shams Dhaka made a number of points, but a fundamental point he made was that our attitudes, i.e. Pakistani's attitudes, are wrong in terms of both the approach to education and health. And he also said that we needed to think again about some of the consequences of the 18th Amendment in the social sector. Mrs. Kasuri made a number of points, but I think one of the very important points she made was the very high dropout rates in public sector schools and the question of management, which I know is very important actually not just in public sector schools, but in public sector hospitals. And but she said there was hope and we could still do it. Mr. Hussain Daud came up with a number of suggestions on how, with our existing resources, we could begin to make a paradigm shift in terms of development. And then we had, at the end of the second session, a very interesting presentation from Mr. Rahmatullah and Mr. Belgrami. They pointed out the need for change in the energy mix which Pakistan uses, the pricing issues and the infrastructure issues being critical to the development of energy and facing the problems. Then we had, of course, the final session, which is just finishing. Ishrat pointed out the negatives and positives in the macroeconomic data and the need for each province to devolve finances to the local government institutions. Mr. Abdullah Yusuf talked about the tax administration reforms, the need for the provincial governments and the FBR to fill what he called the tax gap, which he estimated at around 800 to 900 billion. And that's interesting because then later Mr. Shahbaz Zaidi talked about a possible gap of about 700 billion. And I myself have often said that even if we go back to the tax GDP ratios of 2001 and 2, that would add about 2.5% of the GDP to our revenues, and that in today's terms would be at least 500 billion, plus. And then we had Gareth Aiken, who gave us, I think, a very, very interesting outlook on how the donor community is looking at it. And he pointed out that for the UK, the issue of drugs, terrorism, the nuclear issue are all very critical. And the UK government is committed and has committed to actually becoming, for whom Pakistan is now going to be the principal donor, recipient. But he pointed out that there's going to be a lot of public opinion pressure on both the UK, the European community, and the US for Pakistan to do something, for itself. And then, of course, we had the radical view from Dr. Akmal, who gave us his three basic initiatives of donations of agricultural land to peasants, and the emphasis on small and medium industry, and creating corporations so that, we could use the facilities of microfinance perhaps to promote areas like dairy development. And then finally Paul, who was very circumspect as usual, basically said that Pakistan is an awkward situation. This is like, chasing 300 runs and losing 5 wickets before you reach 100, you see. So, basically what you pointed out was, the IMF's role, of course, as an institution which is not always understood, but also the need for Pakistan to actually get its own act together so that it can achieve high growth in a sustainable fashion. And there I will end, Amina, and request you to maybe thank everyone and wind it up.
Thank you, Moin. Actually, before winding up, may I have the pleasure of giving our mementos to our speakers? It'll just take a minute. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank all our distinguished speakers here today. I think every session, I found it very educational, and I think I've certainly come out of it having learnt a lot. So thank you very much I know how busy all of you are, and yet you have come here from Lahore, from Islamabad, and of course Karachi. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been a very stimulating day. And we really appreciate the presence of all our speakers here today. I would especially like to thank Mr. Kamal Asfar for generously consenting to be our rapporteur. Thank you very much, Kamal. And I think you said, thank you. I think you said in a week or so you'll give us the report, and that's absolutely wonderful. Ji, oh, bahut shukriya. And above all, thank you, Moin. It's been wonderful working with you, and thank you for organizing this and for being here all day and summarizing. And it's been, I think, it's been a great success thanks to your efforts. I just want to say very quickly why we've done this, why we had this conference. Because we at the OICCI, I feel that we have an important role to play in this country to do a bit as far as ensuring stability is concerned. And we have been very concerned in the current the current fiscal, energy, public education, health, all the challenges that the country is continuing to face. And we feel that these challenges have been so consistent that they are not sustainable. And we do feel that we have a responsibility to play our role and to highlight these challenges. And that's why we wanted to have this seminar, so we could examine the genesis and the roots of these various issues, and to also identify them, to raise awareness about them in the public mind. Because we feel that I think the public feels that, it's all right, we'll just continue. But I think it's important to make them aware of the gravity of the issue. And at the same time, with the help of all our speakers and their wonderful presentations and talks, we feel that some solution is bound to emerge. So our objective in having this was to generate a debate, a dialogue, and push this debate to a consensus. Because I think it's only through a consensus that we can hope to rectify a situation which, whenever some solutions are tried to be implemented, there is such strong public and political resistance that I think it's very important that we somehow try and arrive at some kind of a consensus, because I think that is the basis for any kind of improvement. So, and I hope that when the report is ready, we will of course discuss it with all our members, and we will present it to the government, directly of course to the government, but also through the media, because at the same time, in order to help and support the government, we have to get public opinion on our side, and for that I think we need, that's the Asiatic Public Relations. So thank you to everybody, and Assalamu Alaikum.